The Empathic Echo. By Thomas King. Chapter 7. Trials of the Mind and Spirit. The first tendrils of understanding began to unfurl within Zan's mind, not as a sudden illumination, but as a slow, deliberate awakening. Ilara's lessons were less about imparting knowledge and more about cultivating a receptiveness, a willingness to listen to the subtlest of whispers from the universe. Time, she had explained, her voice a low murmur in the quiet of their secluded training grove, is not a rigid, unyielding river. It is a vast, intricate ocean, with currents, eddies, and depths that most never perceive. Your gift, Zan, is the ability to sense these currents, to feel their pull, their flow, their very texture. He had initially approached the concept with the same earnestness he applied to learning sword forms or deciphering ancient texts. He expected concrete techniques, specific gestures, or arcane incantations. Instead, Ilara guided him towards introspection, towards an almost meditative stillness. They would sit for hours, the rustling leaves and distant birdsong forming a natural symphony around them, while Ilara instructed him to simply be. Quiet the cacophony of your own thoughts, she would say, her gaze steady and encouraging. Let the incessant chatter of the immediate moment fade. Listen not with your ears, but with the core of your being. What do you feel beyond the beating of your heart, beyond the breath in your lungs? The initial attempts were frustrating. His mind, so accustomed to the linear progression of cause and effect, rebelled against the notion of passive perception. He would strain, attempting to force himself to sense something, anything. But the more he pushed, the more elusive the sensation became. It was like trying to catch smoke with a clenched fist. He felt a dull thrum of anxiety, a self-imposed pressure that only served to further cloud his nascent awareness. Ilara, ever patient, would gently guide him back. Do not seek. Do not demand. Merely observe. Imagine yourself a leaf upon the surface of the water. You do not push the water, you allow it to carry you. Feel its subtle tugs, its gentle shifts. Slowly, painstakingly, the first glimmers began to emerge. It started not as a distinct sensation, but as a vague feeling of wrongness. A patch of air that felt thicker, heavier, as if time itself had pooled there, becoming sluggish and viscous. Or, conversely, a fleeting instant where the world seemed to blur, moving with an unnatural haste, as if a moment had been compressed and sped past him in the blink of an eye. These were not grand, dramatic events, but minute distortions, easily dismissed as tricks of the light or the fatigue of intense concentration. Yet, Ilara recognized them. You are beginning to perceive the eddies, Zan, she would affirm, a hint of pride in her tone. Those are places where the temporal flow is disrupted. The past is clinging, or the future is rushing forward too eagerly. One particular exercise involved focusing on an object, a weathered stone or a gnarled branch, and attempting to sense its history. Ilara instructed him to clear his mind, to simply let his awareness flow towards the object. Do not try to see its past, she advised. Just feel its presence. Feel the weight of the moments it has endured. Does it feel older than its appearance suggests? Does it carry the echoes of storms it has weathered, of seasons it has passed through? At first, it was simply tactile. He felt the rough texture of the stone, the cool, woody grain of the branch. But then, with sustained effort, a subtle sensation would arise. A faint resonance, like the distant hum of a forgotten melody. Sometimes, it was a whisper of cold, of a winter's harsh embrace. Other times, a warmth, a memory of sunlight that had baked it for centuries. These were not visions, nor were they clear sounds, but an impression, a feeling woven into the very essence of the object. He began to understand that time left its imprint, its residue, on everything it touched. He was learning to read the scars left by its passage. This training was a crucible for his mental fortitude. Maintaining the required level of focus, of internal stillness, was exhausting. His mind, trained for years in active problem-solving and logical deduction, found this passive receptivity to be a profound challenge. There were days when his concentration frayed, when the familiar anxieties of his past, the uncertainties of his present, and the dread of his unknown future would surge back, overwhelming the delicate attunement he was striving to achieve. On those days, the grove would feel stifling, the silence oppressive. He would feel a growing sense of inadequacy, a fear that he was fundamentally incapable of grasping this ability, that he was merely a vessel of temporal anomaly, not its master. Elara, sensing his struggle, would never chide him. Instead, she would offer a different perspective. "The mind is like a wild horse, Zan," she once told him, as he slumped against a moss-covered tree, his head in his hands. "It rears and bucks, it resists the bridle. You cannot simply break it. You must learn to understand its nature, to work with its energy, to guide it gently. When the thoughts come, acknowledge them. Do not fight them. Observe their passing, like clouds in the sky. Then, gently, with patience, guide your awareness back to the present moment, back to the temporal flow." He learned that true mastery wasn't about eliminating thought, but about detaching from its incessant demands, about creating a quiet space within the storm of his own consciousness. He began to practice these techniques even when he was not with Elara, during his solitary walks through the city or while tending to his chores. He would find a quiet corner, close his eyes, and try to feel the subtle hum of the city's temporal currents. He noticed how the marketplace, with its bustling crowds and hurried transactions, had a frantic, compressed tempo, while the ancient library, with its hushed reverence for knowledge, felt slower, more contemplative, as if time itself had slowed to absorb the wisdom within its walls. The most challenging aspect was learning to distinguish between genuine temporal anomalies and his own internal projections. Was the faint shimmer he sometimes perceived around certain ancient artifacts truly an echo of its past, or just a manifestation of his desire to find something significant? Was the sudden feeling of dread that washed over him when he passed a particular darkened alleyway a premonition of danger, or a lingering residue of past fear? Elara cautioned him against jumping to conclusions, against attributing every subtle sensation to his temporal gift. "Discernment is crucial, Zan," she stressed. "The untrained mind can easily mistake its own internal landscape for external reality. You must learn to calibrate your perceptions, to cross-reference what you feel with what you observe, and to develop a certain skepticism, even of your own heightened senses." She introduced him to the concept of temporal echoes, residual impressions left behind by strong emotional events. These were not mere memories, but almost tangible impressions, fleeting sensations that could momentarily imbue a place with the feeling of a past occurrence. He learned to sense the phantom chill of a long-past winter's night in a deserted courtyard, or the faint, spectral warmth of joy that seemed to linger in the stones of a festival square, even on a quiet, ordinary day. These echoes were subtler than the temporal eddies, more like whispers than pronouncements. They required a finer attunement, a deeper quietude to perceive. During one particularly grueling session, Elara led him to a place known for its tragic history, a site where a great fire had once ravaged a district. As they stood amidst the rebuilt structures, Elara instructed him to open his mind, to allow the impressions of that event to wash over him. At first, he felt nothing but the present-day sounds and scents. Then, as he pushed deeper, a faint heat began to prickle his skin, not a physical heat, but an impression of it. He smelled a phantom scent of smoke, acrid and biting, and then, for a fleeting instant, a wave of panic, raw and desperate, surged through him. It was overwhelming, an alien emotion that did not feel entirely his own. He gasped, stumbling back, his eyes wide with a terror he hadn't truly experienced but had deeply felt. "Breathe, Zan." Elara's voice cut through the disorientation, calm and steady. "You are feeling the echo. The fear, the desperation of those who were caught in the flames. It is a powerful imprint, a testament to the intensity of their experience. But it is not your fear. It is theirs. Acknowledge it, understand it, and then let it pass. Do not let it anchor itself within you." It took him a long time to recover from that experience. The phantom smoke seemed to linger in his senses, the echo of panic a disquieting hum beneath his own emotions. He realized the danger of becoming lost in these temporal impressions, of allowing the past to drown out the present. This was the precipice Elara had warned him about, the point where his gift could become a burden, a source of confusion and delusion. Elara then introduced him to the concept of temporal dissonance. "Sometimes," she explained, "moments do not flow smoothly. They become caught, twisted. Imagine a dropped tapestry, its threads snagged and pulled awry. These are moments of dissonance, where the natural progression of time is disrupted, not by an eddy or an echo, but by a kind of temporal friction. She guided him to focus on a specific, ancient clockwork device she kept hidden in her study, a complex contraption that had been rendered inert for centuries. This device, she said, was designed to measure something beyond mere seconds and minutes. It was meant to gauge the subtle fluctuations of the temporal weave. Observe it. Feel its stillness, its silence. Now focus on the air around it. Does it feel hesitant? As if the moments themselves are struggling to move past it? As he concentrated, a peculiar sensation began to form. It wasn't the thickness of an eddy or the fleeting warmth of an echo. It was a subtle resistance, a feeling of stagnation, as if the very air around the clockwork was struggling to flow, snagged on unseen barbs. It was a low-grade, persistent dissonance, the temporal equivalent of a grinding halt. He felt a subtle pressure in his temples, a faint nausea, as if his own internal clock were out of sync with his surroundings. "You are sensing the dissonance, Zan," Elara confirmed. "The moment is stuck, caught in a loop of its own inertness. The device itself creates this pocket of temporal resistance." The training was relentless, pushing the boundaries of his concentration and mental endurance. Each lesson demanded a deeper level of introspection and a more refined sensitivity. He learned that the stillness Elara sought was not an absence of activity, but an absence of internal noise, a clearing of the mental fog that so often obscured the subtler realities of existence. He began to understand that his journey was not merely about learning to perceive time, but about learning to master himself, to quiet the inner turmoil that threatened to drown out the delicate whispers of the temporal fabric. The path ahead was long, and the challenges were immense, but for the first time, Zen felt a genuine sense of progress, a growing awareness that he was indeed capable of navigating the intricate currents of time. He was no longer just a passive anomaly. He was an observer, and perhaps, one day, a conductor of the grand symphony of moments. The whispers of the past, once faint impressions on the temporal fabric, began to coalesce, not into coherent narratives, but into fractured shards of what felt like his own life. Zan found himself adrift in moments that were not his own, yet resonated with an unnerving familiarity. These weren't the gentle echoes of events long past, like the phantom warmth of sunlight on an ancient stone. These were raw, visceral fragments, imbued with the acrid scent of smoke and the chilling tang of fear. One moment, he was standing in the serene training grove with Elara, the air alive with the scent of damp earth and pine. The next, the world fractured. The grove dissolved into a roaring inferno, the sky choked with black smoke. He saw, with horrifying clarity, not through his own eyes, but through the eyes of someone else, a blur of terrified faces turning towards a towering inferno. A woman's scream, raw and desperate, pierced the cacophony of crackling flames, a sound that vibrated in his very bones. He felt a desperate urge to act, a primal instinct to shield, to protect. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision snapped, leaving him gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs, the phantom heat still prickling his skin. Elara's hand, cool and steady, rested on his shoulder, her presence a grounding anchor in the swirling chaos of his mind. "Breathe, Zan," she urged, her voice a low, reassuring melody against the fading roar. "You are experiencing a temporal resonance, a strong imprint from a past event. It is powerful, but it is not you." He tried to heed her words, to dissect the sensation, to categorize it as she had taught him. But the visceral terror that had gripped him was too potent, too personal. It felt less like an echo and more like a buried truth clawing its way to the surface. He recalled Elara's earlier lessons about temporal dissonance, about moments becoming snagged. Was this a snag, a chaotic rupture in the fabric of time? Or was it something deeper, something intrinsically tied to him? During his solitary meditations, the fragments intensified. He saw a fleeting image of a burning village, the familiar thatched roofs engulfed in a hungry orange blaze. He felt the searing heat, smelled the acrid smoke, and heard the desperate cries of fleeing villagers. In one particularly jarring flash, he saw a face, a woman's face, etched with terror, her eyes wide with a desperate plea. He didn't recognize her, yet a profound ache, a sense of loss so profound it stole his breath, surged through him. It was as if a phantom limb had been amputated, leaving a gaping wound in his soul. He felt an overwhelming surge of protective instinct, a desperate need to shield her from the encroaching flames. Then, another vision, even more disorienting. He was running, the ground scorched beneath his bare feet, the air thick with heat and terror. He felt an inexplicable power surging through him, a raw, untamed energy that pulsed in his very core. He reached out his hands, not knowing what he was doing, and the world around him warped. The flames seemed to recoil, the roaring inferno momentarily subdued, as if time itself had bent to his will. It was a desperate, instinctive act, a desperate attempt to escape the horrifying reality. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. The sheer, unbridled power felt alien, a force he had no control over, yet wielded with a desperate ferocity. These fragmented memories were like a persistent fever, clouding his thoughts and leaving him unsettled. They were too vivid, too emotionally charged to be mere echoes. They felt like his own. But how could they be? His earliest clear memories were of the quiet orphanage, the sterile halls, the distant, indifferent faces of the caretakers. There was no burning village, no desperate escape, no woman with eyes full of terror. "Elara," he began one evening, his voice hesitant, as they sat by the flickering hearth in her secluded cottage. The scent of dried herbs and aged parchment hung in the air, a stark contrast to the smoke and fear that haunted his visions. "I've been experiencing things. Glimpses. Not just echoes of places, but scenes. And I feel them. I feel the fear, the heat. Sometimes I feel a power within me, a surge, as if I've done something to alter time itself." He paused, struggling to articulate the terrifying implications. "It's like my own memories are fractured, but these fragments, they feel too real to be invented." Elara listened patiently, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. She did not dismiss his words, nor did she offer immediate reassurance. She simply observed, a silent testament to her understanding that true healing and growth often came from facing the uncomfortable truths. "The mind, Zan," she said softly, her voice like the rustle of ancient scrolls, "is a labyrinth. It guards its deepest chambers with formidable defenses, especially when those chambers hold unbearable pain. The traumas we experience, particularly those that involve immense fear or the shattering of our perceived reality, can be deliberately compartmentalized, sealed away to protect the self." She gestured towards the dancing flames in the hearth. "Imagine a great fire, so consuming that the very structure of a place crumbles. The memory of such an event can be so potent, so devastating, that the mind, in its wisdom or its desperation, chooses to forget. Not all of it, perhaps. But the sharpest edges, the most unbearable truths, are often blunted, buried beneath layers of time and denial. But what if those buried truths are the key?" Zan pressed, the fragmented visions fueling a growing urgency within him. "What if this power I felt, this manipulation of time, it's connected to why I was at the orphanage? Why I have no clear memory of my early life?" Elara's eyes held a depth of sorrow that mirrored his own burgeoning fear. "It is possible, Zan. Your ability to perceive temporal currents, to sense echoes and dissonances, is a profound gift. But such gifts are rarely born of simple circumstance. They often arise in response to extraordinary events, to situations that strain the very fabric of existence, including the fabric of time itself." She rose and walked towards a shelf filled with ancient tomes and curious artifacts. Her fingers brushed over a smooth, obsidian orb, its surface catching the firelight. "The past is not merely a collection of events, Zan. It is a tapestry, woven with threads of action, reaction, emotion, and consequence. Sometimes, in moments of extreme duress, the threads can become tangled, ripped, or even deliberately rewoven. Those who possess your sensitivity, your connection to the temporal flow, might find themselves at the heart of such unraveling." She turned back to him, her expression earnest. "These fragmented memories, these sensations of power, are not necessarily a curse. They are clues. The pain you feel is real, the fear is potent. But they are also the breadcrumbs leading you towards understanding. Your task now is not to suppress them, not to run from the discomfort they bring, but to approach them with the same discernment you apply to sensing temporal eddies. Observe them. Feel them. But do not let them consume you." Zan nodded, the weight of her words settling upon him. He understood that his journey was becoming far more perilous than he had ever imagined. Learning to perceive time was one thing, confronting the possibility that his own past was a landscape of temporal manipulation and profound trauma was another entirely. The fragmented visions, once dismissed as confusing echoes, now felt like the first tremors of an earthquake, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed edifice of his present reality. The desire for answers burned brighter than ever, but it was now tempered by a chilling apprehension. What had he done? And what if the power he had glimpsed was still within him, waiting to be unleashed once more? The thought was both a terrifying prospect and the only path forward. He had to understand, even if understanding meant confronting the darkest corners of his own existence. The echoes were no longer just whispers. They were becoming a clamor, demanding his attention, pulling him back into the heart of a past he desperately needed to reclaim, yet profoundly feared. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his trials of the mind and spirit had only just begun. The true test was not in sensing time, but in facing what time had made of him, and what he had made of time. He closed his eyes, not to meditate, but to brace himself for the inevitable onslaught of fragmented realities. The journey inward was proving to be far more dangerous than any external quest. The sparring arena, usually a place of disciplined exertion and controlled power, crackled with an unnatural tension. Elara, her expression one of focused intensity, stood on the periphery, her hands weaving intricate patterns in the air. Before Zan, the very stones of the arena floor began to shift, to writhe. They coalesced, not into the familiar, lumbering forms of training dummies, but into something far more primal, far more terrifying. It rose before him, a hulking silhouette of raw, elemental fury, a golem of rage. It wasn't merely a construct of earth and stone. It was an embodiment of unleashed fury. Crimson light pulsed from within its rough-hewn core, casting an infernal glow across the polished stone. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable anger that seemed to seep from the very pores of the golem. Zan felt it immediately, a dark, resonant thrumming that vibrated in his chest, an unwelcome echo of something he desperately tried to keep buried. This was no ordinary training exercise. This was a direct confrontation with the tempest he feared resided within. The golem let out a guttural roar, a sound that was less a vocalization and more a seismic exhalation of pure, unadulterated rage. It moved with a brutal, unthinking force, its massive fists slamming into the ground, sending shockwaves that buckled the stone. Zen instinctively raised his arms, a warding gesture that felt woefully inadequate against such raw power. The impact of the golem's blows wasn't just physical. It was an assault on his very psyche, each thunderous strike jarring loose the carefully constructed walls he had built around his own volatile emotions. He dodged a sweeping blow that would have splintered him into 1,000 pieces, the wind of its passage whipping his hair. He could feel the golem's rage, a blinding, all-consuming inferno, and with it, a dangerous spark ignited within him. It was a familiar heat, a scorching ember he had spent years trying to extinguish, a primal fury born of abandonment, of helplessness, of a past he couldn't quite grasp but felt in the marrow of his bones. The golem's roars seemed to amplify the silent scream building within his own throat. "Control, Zan!" Elara's voice, though calm, cut through the cacophony. "This is a reflection. Do not let it become your reality." But the golem was relentless. It was a perfect storm of destruction, a mirror held up to his deepest fears. Its attacks were not calculated, they were born of instinct, of a desire to obliterate. Each shattered stone, each gouge in the arena floor, felt like a blow against his own self-control. He parried a swift jab with his forearm, the impact jarring his teeth, and the golem's retaliatory swing sent him skidding across the ground. He tasted dust and the metallic tang of blood from a split lip. The golem's eyes, two burning embers within its stony visage, fixed on him, and Zan felt a terrifying kinship. It was a creature of pure, unbridled emotion, and it was feeding on the suppressed anger that was beginning to surge within him. He could feel it clawing its way to the surface, a volcanic pressure building behind his eyes, a tremor running through his limbs. His own hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. He felt a desperate urge to meet the golem's fury with his own, to unleash the storm that had been brewing for so long. He remembered the fragmented visions, the burning village, the terrified faces, the the overwhelming surge of power. Was this it? Was this the untamed force that had erupted in those moments? The golem lunged again, a terrifying display of brute strength, and Zan found himself not just defending, but actively pushing back, not with a calculated strategy, but with a desperate, primal surge of his own burgeoning anger. His defensive stance faltered as a wave of pure frustration washed over him. He felt the unfairness of it all, the constant struggle, the gnawing uncertainty of his past. The golem's raw power was a catalyst, chipping away at his carefully maintained composure. He felt the heat in his veins intensify, the controlled breathing exercises he practiced with Elara dissolving into ragged gasps. The golem's rage was a contagion, and he was becoming infected. "No!" he grunted, pushing himself up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The golem's power was intoxicating, a dark allure that promised release from the constant vigilance. He felt a flicker of something akin to exhilaration as he narrowly avoided another crushing blow. It was a dangerous sensation, this feeling of matching the golem's ferocity, of embracing the chaos. He saw an opening, a moment of apparent imbalance in the golem's relentless assault. Instead of exploiting it with precision, driven by the burgeoning fury, he roared a raw, uncharacteristic sound that tore from his throat. He charged, not with grace, but with a reckless abandon, intending to meet the golem's brute force head-on. The golem seemed to surge with renewed vigor, as if sensing Zan's internal shift. Its crimson glow intensified, and the ground around it began to crack. The air crackled with malevolent energy. Zan felt his own energy coiling, a potent, volatile force gathering within him. He could feel the edges of his control fraying, the carefully constructed dam beginning to burst. He swung his fist, not with the precision of a trained warrior, but with the raw, unthinking power of a creature driven by instinct. His knuckles connected with the golem's stony forearm, and the impact sent a jolt of searing pain up his arm. But more than pain, he felt a surge of something else, a wild, untamed power that mimicked the golem's own. It was a terrifying realization. His own suppressed rage was aligning with the golem's, creating a dangerous resonance. The golem staggered back, not from the force of the blow, but from the unexpected surge of raw emotion Zan had unleashed. For a fleeting moment, the golem's roaring subsided, replaced by a guttural growl that sounded almost like recognition. It was as if the elemental spirit had found a kindred spirit, a source of the very fury it embodied. Elara's voice, sharp and urgent, broke through the haze of Zan's rising anger. "Zan! You are fueling it! Remember your training! This is not you!" Her words were a lifeline, a stark reminder of who he was supposed to be, of the discipline he had strived to cultivate. He looked at his own hands, still clenched, still vibrating with a power he barely understood. He saw the raw, destructive energy radiating from the golem, and for the first time, he saw it not just as an external threat, but as a potential reflection of his own inner darkness. The golem's rage was a wildfire, and he was about to become its fuel. He forced himself to pull back, the effort immense, like trying to swim against a raging torrent. He stumbled, gasping for air, the golem's burning gaze still fixed upon him. The instinct to lash out, to unleash the dammed-up fury, was still strong, a siren song of destructive release. He could feel the golem's immense power, a tangible entity in the arena, and he knew that if he succumbed, if he let his own rage take hold, the consequences would be catastrophic. He closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in a desperate attempt to regain control. He focused on Elara's words, on the core tenets of his training: discipline, control, understanding. He visualized the carefully constructed walls around his anger, not to imprison it, but to channel it, to transform it. He imagined the golem's rage as a wild, untamed river, and his own suppressed anger as a reservoir behind it. If he opened the floodgates, both would rage uncontrolled. If he could find a way to divert the flow, to harness its power without succumbing to its destructive nature, then perhaps he could survive this trial. He took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, a stark contrast to the burning inferno he felt within. He forced his clenched fists to relax, the muscles screaming in protest. He opened his eyes, and the golem was still there, its raw fury undiminished, its crimson glow a constant reminder of the destructive potential that lay dormant within him. But something had shifted. While the golem's rage still thrummed in the air, Zan no longer felt entirely overwhelmed by it. He still felt the dark resonance, the tempting pull of destructive power, but he also felt a nascent sense of defiance, a burgeoning understanding that this golem was not just a force of nature, but a test. A test of his resolve, a test of his ability to master the storm within. He was not the golem, and he would not let its rage become his own. The fight was far from over, but the tide, however infinitesimally, had begun to turn. The battle was no longer just against the elemental fury before him, but against the far more insidious rage that festered within his own soul. He had to find a way to dismantle the golem, not by meeting its power with his own untamed fury, but by finding the discipline, the control, and perhaps, the understanding that would disarm it. This was the true trial, the confrontation with the shadow self, and the path forward was fraught with peril. The golem of rage was a formidable foe, but the enemy Zan truly had to conquer resided within. The air in the chamber grew unnaturally cold, a chill that seeped not just into the skin, but into the very marrow of one's bones. It was a different kind of cold than the biting winds of winter or the frosted breath of a mountain peak. This was the frigid touch of dread. Zan found himself no longer standing on solid ground, but adrift in a swirling miasma of shadows and whispers. The sparring arena, the golem of rage, the echo of Ilara's voice, all of it had dissolved, replaced by a disorienting void. He was alone, yet acutely aware of unseen presences, a prickling sensation on his skin that spoke of judgment and scrutiny. Before him, the darkness coalesced. It wasn't a solid form, not like the golem, but a shifting, intangible entity. It was an ethereal phantasm, a creature born of pure psychological torment. It had no discernible features, yet Zan felt its gaze upon him, a thousand unseen eyes piercing his soul. The whispers intensified, weaving a tapestry of his deepest insecurities, each word a venomous dart aimed at his most vulnerable points. They spoke of his inherent power, not as a gift, but as a curse, a destructive force that would inevitably lead to isolation. They echoed his abandonment, his fear that no one could truly understand or accept him, and the gnawing anxiety about the unknown origins of his past, the fragments of memory that haunted his dreams, hinting at a power he couldn't control and a trauma he couldn't fully recall. "You are a monster," a voice whispered, seeming to emanate from all directions at once. "A weapon waiting to be unleashed. They will fear you. They will abandon you. Just as you were before." Zan flinched, the words striking a raw nerve. This was different from the golem's brute force. The golem had been an external manifestation of anger, a physical representation of his untamed emotions. This phantasm, however, was a mirror reflecting his deepest, most insidious fears. It was the voice of his own self-doubt amplified, given spectral form. He instinctively raised his hands, a gesture of defense, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that no physical barrier could ward off this assault. "You cannot control it," the whispers continued, insidious and persuasive. "This power within you. It is a wildfire. It will consume you, and then it will consume everything you care about. You are destined for solitude, for the cold embrace of eternal loneliness." He felt a phantom pressure, as if unseen hands were constricting his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. The spectral form of the phantasm seemed to writhe, its form shifting to embody his anxieties. At one moment, it loomed over him as a towering figure of judgment, its indistinct mass radiating disapproval. The next, it dissolved into 1,000 tiny, skittering shadows, each one a representation of his fear of the unknown, the unremembered horrors of his past. He saw flashes, disjointed images, a burning landscape, the scent of smoke, a child's cry. Were these echoes of his true origin? Was the power that surged within him a harbinger of destruction, a mark of an irredeemable past? "Look at yourself," the phantasm hissed, its voice now a sibilant whisper that slithered into his mind. "You are a walking catastrophe. The closer they get, the more they will be hurt. Your existence is a danger." He stumbled backward, the ground beneath him feeling increasingly unstable. It was as if the very fabric of reality was fraying, dissolving at the edges. He saw Ilara's face superimposed over the swirling shadows, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. He remembered her words from the arena. This is a reflection. Do not let it become your reality. But how could he not? The phantasm was weaving his own thoughts, his own fears, into a suffocating reality. She will leave you, the whispers taunted, sensing his reliance on Alara. Everyone leaves eventually. They cannot bear the darkness you carry. You will be alone, always alone, with the monster you are. A wave of despair washed over Zan. The loneliness was a tangible ache, a deep-seated wound that the phantasm was expertly probing. He felt the urge to lash out, to strike at this ephemeral tormentor, but he knew it was futile. The golem had been a physical entity, a foe he could confront with force. This was a battle of the mind, a war waged within the confines of his own psyche. He sank to his knees, the swirling shadows seeming to press in on him, threatening to engulf him entirely. The fear was paralyzing, a cold dread that seeped into his very soul. He saw himself, isolated and forgotten, a pariah burdened by a power he could never control. The fragments of his past, the burning images, the unanswered questions, they all coalesced into a terrifying prophecy of his future. Then a flicker. Amidst the overwhelming darkness, a faint light began to pulse. It wasn't the crimson glow of the golem, but a steady, serene luminescence. It was Alara's presence, not her physical form, but the resonance of her teachings, the strength of her belief in him. He remembered her calm demeanor, her unwavering patience, her insistence on understanding rather than suppression. Fear is not a weakness, Zan. Her voice, though silent, echoed in his mind. It is a signpost. It points to what needs to be understood, what needs to be healed. He repeated her words like a mantra, forcing himself to focus on them, to anchor himself in their truth. The phantasm recoiled slightly, as if the light of understanding was anathema to its nature. It shifted again, no longer a hulking manifestation of judgment, but a swirling vortex of confusion, representing his fear of the unknown. You do not know who you are. The whispers assailed him, their tones shifting from accusation to a more insidious suggestion of futility. Your past is a void, your future uncertain. How can you move forward when you are adrift in such ignorance? Zen took a shaky breath, forcing himself to meet the swirling chaos with a newfound resolve. He acknowledged the uncertainty. He admitted the fear of his unknown origins. But he also recognized that these fears, while powerful, did not define him. They were parts of his journey, not the destination. He looked at his hands, the very instruments of the power that terrified him. He saw not a weapon of destruction, but a potential for growth, for protection. My past is unknown, he admitted aloud, his voice a little shaky but gaining strength. But it does not dictate my present. My power is a part of me, and I will learn to wield it, not to destroy, but to understand. To protect. The ethereal phantasm seemed to flicker, its form becoming less defined, the whispers losing their venom. It was as if his acceptance, his refusal to be consumed by the fear, was starving it. He was no longer fighting it head-on with resistance, but with a quiet, internal acknowledgement. He was not trying to banish the fear, but to understand its roots, to see it for what it was, an illusion woven from his own insecurities. He focused on the fear of isolation, the deep-seated belief that he was inherently flawed and would be left alone. He remembered Alara's steadfast companionship, the genuine care in her eyes. He recalled the camaraderie he had found with others, the shared purpose that bound them. He was not alone. Even in his struggles, there were those who stood with him, who believed in him. I am not destined for solitude, he stated, his voice firm. I am capable of connection. I am capable of being loved, and of loving in return. My power does not have to be a barrier, it can be a bridge. With each admission, each reframing of his deepest anxieties, the phantasm waned. The swirling shadows receded, the oppressive cold lessened. The spectral whispers faded into a murmur, then silence. The oppressive weight on his chest lifted, and he could breathe freely again. He was still in the void, but it was no longer a hostile, terrifying place. It was a space of quiet contemplation, of introspection. He looked at the dissipating remnants of the phantasm, the fading echoes of his deepest fears. He saw them not as insurmountable obstacles, but as shadows that could be illuminated by understanding. His fear of his own power was still present, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer a paralyzing dread. It was a challenge, an invitation to explore and master. His fear of isolation had been met with the warmth of connection, the reassurance of shared bonds. And his fear of the unknown past, while still a mystery, was no longer a prophecy of doom. It was a chapter yet to be written, a journey of discovery. Elara's voice, clear and steady, seemed to guide him back. The labyrinth of fear is built from the bricks of our own anxieties, Zan. But within each brick lies a seed of truth, a vulnerability waiting to be understood. By acknowledging the fear, by dissecting its origins, you disarm it. You transform the chains of dread into the tools of self-awareness. He felt a gentle tug, a sense of being drawn back from the precipice. The void began to solidify, the disorienting nature of the chamber giving way to a more familiar, grounded reality. He felt the weight of his own body, the steady rhythm of his heart. He had navigated the labyrinth of fear, not by conquering it with force, but by understanding its architecture, by recognizing that the most terrifying monsters were often the ones we carried within ourselves. The trial was not about eradicating fear, but about learning to walk alongside it, to recognize its whispers for what they were, and to choose a path illuminated by courage and self-acceptance. The ethereal phantasm had been a formidable adversary, but in its dissolution, it left behind not emptiness, but a profound sense of inner quietude, a hard-won clarity that promised resilience in the face of future trials. The shadows had receded, not vanished entirely, but no longer held dominion over his spirit. He had faced the specter of his deepest anxieties and emerged not unscathed, but stronger, armed with the quiet power of self-understanding. The cacophony of his internal struggle began to subside, not with a sudden silence, but with a gradual fading, like the distant echo of a storm. The spectral whispers, the phantom anxieties, the chilling accusations that had clawed at his sanity, now receded into the background, leaving behind a profound stillness. It was a stillness that felt not empty, but pregnant with possibility, a fertile ground where new understanding could take root. Zan found himself no longer adrift in the maelstrom of his fears, but standing on a quiet, unmoving plain, the remnants of the ethereal phantasm dissolving around him like mist under a rising sun. In this newfound quiet, a startling realization dawned. The power that had always felt like a wild, untamed beast, a source of both potential and dread, was not an external force to be conquered. It was, he understood now with an almost visceral clarity, inextricably bound to the landscape of his emotions. The fear, the anger, the loneliness that had been amplified and weaponized by the phantasm, these were not separate from his temporal abilities. They were the very currents that shaped and directed them. His power was not a tool independent of his being, but an extension of it, an intricate dance between his will and his inner state. He had always viewed his temporal abilities as something to be controlled, a volatile force to be suppressed lest it lash out. The golem of rage had been the physical manifestation of that suppressed anger, a monstrous outburst he had to contain. The ethereal phantasm, in its spectral torment, had preyed on his fear of isolation and the unknown, whispering that his power would only lead to ostracization. But in the aftermath, a different perspective bloomed. What if his power wasn't meant to be suppressed, but understood? What if his emotions, the very things he had been taught to fear, were the keys to unlocking the true potential of his abilities? As this thought took root, a subtle shift occurred. The world around him, which had been a disorienting void, began to regain a semblance of form. It wasn't the sharp, defined reality he was accustomed to, but something far more fluid, more temporal. He saw it then, not as a visual spectacle, but as an intrinsic perception, a fundamental awareness. Time itself seemed to unfold before him, not as a linear progression of seconds and minutes, but as a vast, interwoven tapestry. He could perceive the subtle currents, the eddies and flows, the moments where destinies intertwined and diverged. It was as if the veil that normally obscured the true nature of temporal mechanics had been lifted, if only for a fleeting instant. He saw the past not as a series of closed doors, but as a shimmering continuum, its echoes still resonating in the present. He glimpsed the future not as a predetermined path, but as a branching network of possibilities, each choice a ripple that sent waves through the fabric of existence. It was overwhelming, exhilarating, and utterly profound. He could see the subtle shifts in causality, the almost imperceptible nudges that could alter an outcome. He understood, for the first time, how his own temporal abilities were not just about manipulating time, but about interacting with its very essence, with the intricate web of cause and effect. This heightened perception wasn't a forceful act, it was a state of being. It was born from a moment of profound acceptance, a willingness to embrace all aspects of himself, the power, the emotions, the fears, the uncertainties. He wasn't fighting against his temporal nature anymore, he was flowing with it. He recognized that his emotional state was not a hindrance to his temporal control, but a fundamental component. When he was consumed by fear or rage, his temporal manipulations became erratic, destructive. But when he found a semblance of inner peace, a balance, his abilities became more refined, more nuanced. He felt a strange harmony, a fleeting, perfect equilibrium. His temporal abilities, usually a source of constant vigilance, now felt as natural as breathing. He could perceive the subtle energies that permeated existence, the delicate threads that connected all things across time. It was like seeing the world with 1,000 new senses, understanding its underlying rhythms and patterns. He saw how moments, seemingly insignificant, could hold immense weight, and how grand events were often the culmination of countless tiny shifts. This wasn't a physical sensation, but a deeply ingrained understanding. He could feel the passage of time in a way he never had before. It was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible presence, a living, breathing entity. He could perceive the subtle hum of the universe, the constant flux and flow that undergirded reality. And within that flow, he saw his own temporal power not as a disruptive force, but as a harmonious note in the grand symphony. He understood that his past, those fragmented memories and unresolved traumas, had been fueling his fear and, consequently, his uncontrolled temporal surges. The ethereal phantasm had exploited this, twisting his uncertainty into a weapon. But in facing those fears, in acknowledging their power and choosing to move beyond them, he had inadvertently created the conditions for this moment of clarity. He had silenced the internal cacophony enough to hear the subtle song of time itself. This fleeting moment was a revelation. It wasn't about suppressing his power or dissecting his emotions into discrete components. It was about integration. It was about recognizing that his temporal gifts and his emotional landscape were two sides of the same coin, intrinsically linked, each influencing and shaping the other. This understanding was not a victory achieved through combat, but through a profound act of self-acceptance. He had stopped fighting himself, and, in doing so, had unlocked a deeper connection to his abilities. He saw how, in moments of intense emotion, his temporal perception would warp. Anger would cause time to appear to speed up, moments blurring into an incomprehensible rush. Fear would make it crawl, each second an agonizing eternity. But in this state of calm, this brief interlude of internal harmony, time flowed with a natural, even cadence. He could perceive the subtle nuances, the almost imperceptible variations that made up the entirety of a moment. He could see the delicate balance of forces at play, the infinitesimal shifts that could lead to monumental changes. This wasn't a passive observation, it was an active engagement. He found that with this clarity, his ability to influence time wasn't just about raw power, but about precision. He could see the potential outcomes of his actions with an unprecedented clarity. He could anticipate the repercussions of a temporal alteration, not through calculation, but through intuitive understanding. It was as if the very fabric of time was offering him insights, guiding his actions. He realized that the fear of his power had been a self-fulfilling prophecy. By constantly fearing its destructive potential, he had inadvertently made it so. The ethereal phantasm had merely amplified these pre-existing fears, reinforcing the narrative of his own perceived monstrosity. But now, with this moment of clarity, he saw that the potential for creation and control was just as inherent in his abilities as the potential for destruction. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the glimpse of understanding, but for the journey that had led him to it. The golem of rage had shown him the destructive power of his untamed emotions. The ethereal phantasm had revealed the insidious nature of his deepest fears. And in their wake, this quiet space had allowed him to synthesize those experiences, to see the interconnectedness of it all. His power was not a curse, it was a gift, a complex instrument that required not suppression, but a deep, intimate understanding of the musician. This clarity, however, was a fragile thing. He knew, with a certainty born of experience, that such profound states of being were often transient. The world would not remain this still, this clear. The challenges would return, the anxieties would resurface, and his powers would undoubtedly be tested again. But this fleeting moment had gifted him something invaluable, a tangible experience of harmony, a glimpse of what mastery could feel like. It was a beacon, a reminder that the path to control lay not in fighting his inner demons, but in understanding them, in integrating them into the whole of who he was. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination that settled deep within his core. He had seen the potential, felt the harmony, and understood the link between his inner state and his temporal abilities. This wasn't the end of his struggle, but the beginning of a new phase, one defined not by fear and suppression, but by exploration and integration. He would continue to learn, to grow, and to strive for that state of balance, knowing that each step closer brought him not only closer to mastering his powers, but closer to understanding himself. The whispers of doubt would surely return, but now, he carried within him the echo of a different voice, the serene hum of time itself, a testament to the power of acceptance and the profound clarity that could bloom in the quiet aftermath of a storm. The fleeting moment of clarity was like a perfectly clear note sung in a vast auditorium, resonating with the truth he could now carry forward, a guiding light for the trials yet to come. He had touched upon a deeper understanding of his temporal nature, realizing that true mastery lay not in the force with which he wielded his abilities, but in the harmony he achieved within himself, a harmony that resonated outwards, shaping the very flow of existence.